Well, hello, my name is Sarah McCubbin, and I'm from 10 Minute Momentum. And today we're going to be talking about how to recover from mistakes and thrive. I don't know about any of you, but I am a recovering perfectionist. That means that I would beat myself up for every little mistake that I made, whether it was something just a common ordinary mistake or something sinful, right? There's the whole gamut of mistakes. We all make them, right? And the problem is some of us have a really bad habit of then kind of hurting ourselves just in the way we think about those mistakes going forward. So you actually have the opportunity to take any mistake you've made and reframe it. And it can actually be something that serves you and other people. Kind of weird, right? It can help other people. It can help you if you choose to learn from the mistake. So this is a way of thinking that we have to kind of train ourselves towards. And I didn't have this growing up. I didn't even do it with my kids when they were really little because I didn't know. And I've kind of stumbled into it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I hope you think it's interesting, that you learn something. And I'll just say it now. If you have questions afterwards, feel free to email me anytime. I think my email's on the last slide. So feel free to email me. I'm an open book. I love to help people with anything social skills related because I had to learn it like other people learn math. Okay, so let's talk about failure. For most of my life, I was terrified of failure. Like I said, I was a perfectionist. And what that actually meant is I would do really well academically in school, but I would kind of avoid signing up for anything that I didn't think I could be excellent at, right? I wouldn't try new things because I might fail. So all of that anxiety came to a full head when I was a freshman in college at a public university. I was 17 and a commuter student, and it was exam day. It was time to show up for my pre-calc exam, and I had done okay in pre-calc in high school. I mean, I had done better than okay. I got an A, but I had struggled in college. I was taking it again, not doing very well. And so I really needed to get a decent grade on this exam. So I showed up early for the exam, a few minutes, and it was scheduled for like 10 o'clock. I showed up, entered this big classroom, and nobody was there. And I thought, I mean, maybe I'm early, right? Maybe it's later. Maybe it's 11 o'clock, right? So then I get out my binder, start looking around for the syllabi, and lo and behold, it was scheduled for 10 a.m. But yesterday at 10 a.m., I was a full 24 hours late for this exam. And as you can imagine, I started to panic, right? My skin's crawling, the anxiety's rising. I'm imagining, yes, I have failed this class now in my head, right? The worst thing ever, I have failed. And so in that moment, I had to decide whether I was going to accept failure, right? Accept that idea in my head, or whether I was going to do something. Now, normally I was kind of a quitter at that age. Something super hard came along, quitting was my default. But I think grades must have been so tightly entwined to my identity that I just knew I had to do something, even if it still meant that I failed. So I found some other students and asked them where the math department was at this big university. And I walked over there because this is before cell phones. We didn't have our professors' emails to get a hold of them. There weren't computer labs everywhere. So I went to that math department and I was able to call my professor at home. And this dear man actually came in like 20 minutes later and gave me the exam, which was crazy, right? Like he went out of his way. He didn't shame me. He didn't tell me like I should have been more responsible. He just came in and gave me the exam. I don't even remember if he took points off for being late. He might have. I didn't do exceptionally well on the exam, but I still passed the class, right? And even more important, I learned a super valuable lesson that day, right? The lesson I learned was one, if you don't ask, the answer is no, always. So if I had not asked him to come in and help me, the answer was no. I would have failed by default. So I always tell this to my kids. Hey, if you want something, or if you need something, or if you made a mistake and it needs to be fixed, you have to ask. Otherwise, the answer is no, because people don't know. And then the second thing I learned was that someday I would be in a position like that professor was, where I could choose to show grace, or I could choose to give somebody what they deserved. He didn't give me what I deserved that day. I deserved to just get a 0 on the exam. And I knew that someday I would be in that position. And I decided then that if I was in that position, I would choose to show grace. So, in that example of failure, right? Like I made a mistake, I wasn't responsible, I didn't read my syllabus the right way. There was a person who showed me grace. And I learned a valuable lesson about failure that day, more than one valuable lesson. So, why does any of this matter? All right. Why does talking about failure matter? It's because we all fail. We all make mistakes and none of us are perfect. So, I like to say that mistakes, failures, they're all opportunities for learning. And once I was able to reframe that in my head, that mistakes are just opportunities to learn, something crazy happened. They stopped bothering me so much. And I was an adult when I learned this. So I'm very interested in helping other people learn it when they're much younger, because I would have tried so many new things if I had understood that failing or making mistakes wasn't the worst thing in the world, right? It was an opportunity to learn something, try something new. So, what are some common failures and mistakes? Doing poorly on a test, loving or wasting money, making poor choices in relationships, saying things we regret, being angry with our family, harming ourselves, being selfish, right? These are all common failures and mistakes. Some of them we could say are worse than others. And that's probably true. We don't have to let our mistakes affect us so that they kind of roll around in our head and affect us forever. Now, as a socially awkward person for most of my life, I've kind of made a habit of studying people. I'm always trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And I often noticed that when people made mistakes, they reacted one of two ways. Some people were kind of like me. They would ruminate on the mistake. They would think about it. They might become depressed, refuse to be around people. Like they were so focused on what they had done or not done that they just couldn't move forward. And then there were other people, and I never understood them. I didn't understand how it worked. There were these other people, they would make mistakes, right? They weren't perfect, but they seemed to let it roll off their shoulders. And very quickly, they'd be telling other people, like, oh, yeah, I did this thing. And yeah, it was dumb, but this is what I learned. And they just kind of let it roll off their shoulders. And it almost seemed like their mistakes benefited them because other people had made the same mistakes. I couldn't figure it out. It wasn't until I was an adult that I actually had the words to identify what I had seen. And by adult, I mean like just a few years ago. So the words I was looking for are a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So the first group of people, the ones that let that roll around in their head, I guess I have this backwards on my slide here. The first group had a fixed mindset. The second group, the ones that seemed to benefit, had a growth mindset. So what is a growth mindset? A growth mindset is an idea that was first pioneered by Dr. Carol Dweck at Stanford University. And it's the idea that our brains and us as people can choose whether we let failure define us. We don't have to let it define us, but we can instead choose to learn from failure and grow from the challenges in our life to be able to solve bigger problems in the future. All right, so again, this failure is an opportunity to learn. On the flip side, a growth mindset, the flip side of a growth mindset, is a fixed mindset. And that views events as fixed or defining. So we can't change what happened and how it has affected us. We just have to live with the consequences and let the chips fall where they may. Someone with a fixed mindset might say, I wish things could be different, but they can't because I messed up too badly. So we can see that having a growth mindset is a much better way to go through life, right? Because we're all going to make mistakes and we might as well be able to use them and learn from them instead of beating ourselves up. Now, when my son was in school, actually he's graduating next month, he was in this engineering program. And in this engineering program, this was like the best picture of failure that I had seen in academics, because usually academics doesn't praise failure. But in this case, it did. And I thought it was interesting. So you had all these juniors and they were given a few $100s and they were allowed to make a trebuchet, which on the right, you can see one that looks the way it should. But they were supposed to work in groups of 4 or 5 students and make these trebuchets to launch pumpkins across the football field. So they were on the goal line, the far end of the football field, and they were supposed to launch these orange gourds all the way across, right? Orange squash. And there were about 8 teams that day. And these teams were super interesting to watch because some of their machines stood sturdy and strong. You had to wonder if a dad who was an engineer was part of the team because they were so perfect looking and everything looked great. And there were other teams that the machines looked like they were built out of scraps from dad's garage. They were maybe a little wobbly, a little uneven, and they were made of a hodgepodge of just random materials, mismatched. Well, on the day of the launch, what was so interesting is all the teams are lined up. There's all these parents there, and these kids start launching these pumpkins, right? And some of the machines, they shot perfectly. They had hydraulics built into it that were powered by a bicycle, very fancy. And there were other kids who their machine goes to launch the pumpkin and the arm kind of flails weakly and the pumpkin spins a little bit and flops right in front of the machine. One machine started to actually fall over. Here you are, you have hundreds of people out here watching their sons, their pride and joys, future engineers, fail massively in front of hundreds of people. And I, as a recovering perfectionist, was sort of horrified. But then I watched the rest of the kids and the teachers. What was happening? For the kids that did really well, their machine worked perfectly. There were pats on the back, words of affirmation. People commented on what worked well. And then for the kids whose machines didn't work so well, there were pats on the back, shaking hands, comments on what didn't work so well. But everyone was smiling. They were happy and they were all learning from each other's success and failures. And it occurred to me that if we would go through life that way, if we would then look at our failures, our flailing trebuchets, that something we tried didn't work right, if we would look at that as a picture of learning instead of failure, I think a lot of us would try more things and be willing to be curious about life. All right, so how can we learn from mistakes and thrive, right? Because that's the goal. Not just to learn, but we want to thrive. First of all, we need to normalize making mistakes, right? When somebody goofs up, it's not helpful when we shame them. One of my favorite verses in the Bible says, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. No condemnation. So We're not condemned when we make mistakes, big mistakes, little mistakes. We need to stop going around thinking of ourselves that way. So we normalize making mistakes. The second thing is we need to be humble about making our mistakes, right? Because we all do it. And then we can, after admitting we're wrong, we need to take some time to look at what happened and figure out why, right? What triggered our poor decision making? Why did we feel like we had to say those hurtful words? How did we feel before we made mistakes, right? Before we made that mistake, what were we feeling? My greatest area of weakness is saying things in anger or in an insensitive way. And when I have taken time to analyze why I exploded, I found that behind that was often a feeling, and that maybe I was tired or overwhelmed. Maybe I felt like nobody was listening to me. Maybe I felt like I was being taken advantage of. None of those are good reasons, by the way, but knowing why I did it can help prevent it in the future. The next thing we can do is learn from other people's mistakes. Now, some people don't like to talk about others. We're afraid we're gossiping. But if we can set that aside for a minute and we can just look at mistakes, maybe it's things in the news, maybe it's people that you know, maybe it's other kids, maybe it's other adults. We can learn a lot from other people's mistakes. We don't have to judge them. We don't even have to know all the facts. My dad is an attorney, and for my entire childhood, dinner time conversation usually revolved around legal stuff, where he would tell us stories of things that were happening with cases he knew about and not tell us the people's names or anything like that. But then we would learn from their mistakes. He would tell us what they had done and what the evidence was. And we would talk about what they did, how they got themselves in that situation. And it helped us think ahead. It helped us learn from their mistakes so we didn't have to make them. And the last thing is similar to being humble, but this is being honest about making mistakes. And what does that mean? We all make mistakes. It is really important not to make another mistake trying to cover up the first one. So when we lie about making mistakes, it doesn't make us trustworthy or make people want to help us. On the other hand, when we're honest about our mistakes, people are much more likely to help us, extend grace, give us second chances. This is true in life. It's also true in the legal system. When people own their mistakes, they're far less likely to get severe consequences. So people are often given an opportunity to have a second chance when they're honest about their part of the problem. Okay, that can be hard, but it's something we can practice with little things. Now, there are some activities we can do. These are really simple things we can do to practice thriving from mistakes. The first thing is reverse engineer mistakes. This is similar to talking about mistakes other people have made, but you start with the mistake and you kind of work backwards. What did they do before they did the mistake? What were they thinking? What were they saying? Who were they spending time with? What were they doing before that? What were they doing before that? What was the original thought they had, bad idea, that led to this horrific mistake, right? You see this with terrible car accidents sometimes. Maybe somebody was speeding down the highway, but maybe the reason they were speeding down the highway is they had a friend in the car that said, "Hey, buddy, how fast do you think this car will go?" And they were so eager to please their friend that they went racing down the highway. Okay, so the original thought that led to the terrible accident, it wasn't even a bad thought. It was just a people-pleasing thought. And so you can do this reverse engineering thing with all kinds of mistakes that people make. It's a great dinner time activity to do with a whole family. Another thing we can do is talk about responding to mistakes. Like if you get in trouble, how will you respond? How will you talk to the teacher? How will you, what will you do if you get in trouble, right? What's the correct response? And my dad used to do this. He did this when we first started driving. If you get pulled over by a police officer, this is how you respond. He walked us through the correct response of how we should respond if we ever made a mistake. So if we practice talking about it, it makes us much more likely to react correctly and also have the opportunity to learn. The next thing is something that I suggest families do. If there's someone in the family that's having a really hard time with failing, right? If somebody is just can't handle it, it's so stressful, they are so anxious, I say practice failing together. And that means go do something that neither one of you are good at. Like go take an art class. If mom and dad aren't good at art and the student isn't good at art, go do that together and you can laugh together about your art, right? Or maybe you go throw a football together and neither one of you are athletic, right? And you laugh about the thing that you didn't do that well. So we can learn by practicing failing, because then it takes away some of the discomfort when we realize, like, hey, the whole world didn't fall apart. And the last thing we can do is reframe mistakes and failures as learning. Okay, when we make mistakes, when we fail, the most important thing we can do is reframe it as quickly as possible as learning. Now, this obviously doesn't work for all out rebellion, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about normal life where people make mistakes and then they can't move forward because all they do is ruminate on it. So when we reframe it, we take what happened and we say, hey, what can I learn from this? What will I do differently next time? Why did I make this mistake? How can I help someone in the future? If you're trying to fix the mistake, who do I need to talk to? Who can help me with this mistake? Who can help me get out of this jam? Okay. Now, this won't apply to everyone. If you are a person that struggles with making mistakes, I want to offer you something that I am starting this summer. It is a group coaching program called Communicate with Confidence, and it's for teens, small groups, and we're going to work through for 6 weeks, one topic a week, where we are going to work through just really common social situations where people struggle and develop some tools for confidence that you can use immediately. It's a beta program. It's going to be very inexpensive. So if that sounds interesting to you, please click the worksheet and there's information in there and there's a place to sign up for more information. I would love to meet with you this summer. I would love to send you information if you think that's something that would be helpful to you. I would love for you to go out from this workshop or from coaching and to feel so much more confident about taking on the next goal you have for yourself in the future. I didn't have that when I was a teenager or a young adult, and I would love for you to have that yourself. It was so nice to be here with you today, and thanks for letting me share.